like to share a story with you about some work that I did with David Wennergren. When I first met David Wennergren, he was the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Navy. And in this story, I want to also just walk you through our process for leveraging polarities. And it's an acronym of SMALL, S-M-A-L-L. The first then is seeing. You need to be able to see the polarity, distinguish a polarity from other difficulties that might in fact be problems to solve. So the first step is seeing the polarity. The second step is mapping it. And when we map a polarity, what we're doing is seeing it more completely because we're paying attention to what are the upsides and the downsides of the two poles that we have identified as the polarity. Then what we need to do is be able to assess the polarity. Once you've mapped it, we can assess how well are we doing at our effort to maximize both upsides and minimize the downsides. From that assessment, we reflect on what we have learned from the assessment to support us moving into the final L, which is leveraging. And each step of this process, seeing, mapping, assessing, learning, and leveraging, is done by engaging key stakeholders in the process. So we're actually dealing with the polarity of directive and participative when we do this. Engaging key stakeholders is very helpful every step of the way. So I'm going to now talk about how we did this five-step process with David Wennergren. So when I met David, it was when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. I had been invited by Barry Frew, a retired naval officer, to do a one-day workshop on polarity thinking with some senior officers in the Navy. And Barry asked me to come in a day early so that I could meet David, who was at that point the Chief Information Officer, and he was going to spend the afternoon with these officers. So I sat in the back of the room, I got introduced to the group, and after the afternoon was done, we went out to dinner together. And David and I sat at the same table in the restaurant with about 4 or 5 other senior naval officers. And they politely asked me, since I had been introduced as the person doing polarity thinking the next day, they said, "So Barry, tell us a little bit about this polarity management stuff." And I started sharing some concepts about polarities, explaining it to them, and they got quite interested. They asked more questions, and so all through the meal we had more application questions and me responding, and David Wennergren didn't say a thing. He was just watching the conversation and how it was going on. After the meal, he said to me, he said, "Barry, this is very interesting. I'm just disappointed that I can't be around tomorrow when you're doing the workshop because I'm flying out at 6:30 to go to another meeting. But I think I'm going to give you a call." I said, "That'll be great." So about 3 months later, I get a call from David, and he has changed positions. He's moved up in this military, and now he has moved from the Chief Information Officer of the Navy to being the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the whole Department of Defense. And as he's pursuing that job and moving to various parts of the Department of Defense, especially within the information community, he said, "What I've noticed is there is a chronic fight that's happening almost everywhere I turn." He said, and it's between two groups of people that have a different agenda. He said, one group says we need to have good information sharing. If we're not sharing information effectively, we cannot serve and protect. We're going to have a 911 incident in which the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, and we can't adequately protect our own country. There's another group that is saying we need to have information security. If our information is not secure, we become vulnerable and we can't serve and protect. He said, "Barry, these two groups are trying to protect the country from the other group." And he said, could this be one of those polarity things? And I said, "I think so, sir." And he said, "Well, would you be willing to come out and work with me and my executive team? Because I'd like to get a handle on this and see if this polarity perspective can be useful." So Barry Frew, the retired naval officer who had invited me to the Naval Postgraduate School in the first place, he and I went together and spent a day with David and his executive team. So in this process, the first step was David seeing it. Now notice he was able to see this polarity even though he just had a dinner conversation about it. So he saw it, and then we took the next steps. So the next step besides seeing it is to map it. So what we did is we came up with this map, information sharing on one pole and information security on the other pole, and then we asked the question. First question was, what would be all the positive results? And the whole executive team was involved in exploring this, right? what are all the positive results you would get if you did a good job of information sharing? And it goes up in that upper left quadrant. The next question is, what would be all the positive results if you did a good job of information security? And it goes in the upper right quadrant. Then, and again, I don't contribute any content. The polarity map itself is a wisdom organizer. The wisdom is in the room. And so this group was able to come up with the content. They owned it, and it's their stuff. And so the next question in terms of filling out the map is, what happens if we overfocus on information sharing to the neglect of information security? And then we get the lower left quadrant, the downside of information sharing alone. The next question is, what happens if we overfocus on information security to the neglect of information sharing? And we end up then getting the downside of information security alone, the lower right quadrant. So we filled out this map together. Once you have a map filled out, then what you can do is you can assess how well are we doing. And what we're asking when we ask ourselves how well we're doing is, to what degree are we getting the upsides of both poles? So we want to almost always be in each upside. So when you look at this infinity loop, you'll notice how high the infinity loop goes in these two upper quadrants. And that represents being almost always in the upside. And then you notice the scale is reversed in the lower level, and what you want to be is almost never in the downsides. So the infinity loop that you see in this map represents a really sort of ideally managed polarity in which we're almost always in both upsides and almost never in both downsides. Then I raised the question to them, is it possible that in the tension between information sharing and information security, that in this power struggle, the information security folks sort of won the day? If that happens, what happens is you get the downside of the winner's preferred pole. So is it that you're caught in the downside of information security, or in this natural tension between the two poles, has the power been on the hands of information sharing, which gets you in the downside of the left pole? So does it look like one of these two? And they sort of actually vary. It looks more like this, in which they were the downside of both. And this is a telltale assessment, because what happens with all polarities is if you focus on or empower one pole to the neglect of the other pole, first you get the downside of the pole on which you overfocus, then you get the downside of the other pole as well, which shows that this has been chronic and going on for a while because they've got themselves in the downside of each. So that's the assessment, and the learning from the assessment is that we need to enhance our capacity to do both. It's gotten us in trouble in both downsides. So how would we do that? Well, the first thing we do is look at action steps to proactively go after both upsides. And so we look at action steps, for example, for information sharing. We look at the content about what are the positive results of good information sharing, and we ask the question, what are we doing or could we be doing to make sure we gain or maintain these positive results in the upside of information sharing? Then we look at action steps. What are we doing or could we be doing to maintain the positive results of information security? And one of the things that happens when you're generating these action steps to maximize both upsides is sometimes you'll come up with an action step and you say, actually, like action step 6 here, it's like it shows up on both upsides. So these are what we call high leverage action steps, and we just put them on both upsides. So if we do this, we double the benefit. So they become highly useful in our process of doing our actions going forward. So we use action steps for each upside quadrant to maximize the upside. That's a proactive approach. Then in the responsive side, what we want to know is early, are we getting into one downside or the other? Because it's always possible to find ourselves in the downside. The question is, how would we know early that we're getting in that downside so we can self-correct? So we ask ourselves the question that we call these early warnings, and there's early warnings for each downside. So we ask the question, how would we know early that we had somehow over-focused on information sharing and are getting ourselves in the downside of information sharing? So they need to be early and measurable indicators that we're in the downside. Then we look at what would be early warnings that would let us know that we're getting in the downside of information security. What's early and what is measurable that we can have. So in this process, we generated this map with the action steps and early warnings, and we walked through this 5-step process. And they were very excited about having this way to explore this option and to deal with the chronic tension they were experiencing. And Dave Wennergren gratefully gave me permission to share this map, but he also told me he just took it on the road. So whenever he was in meetings, he began the meetings in the information community by saying, this is a polarity, we need to leverage it, we can leverage it, we need to stop fighting about this, because this is not an either-or choice, this is a both-and issue. So let's get to work and leverage it well, and this map gives us a start.